Soon after sunset on June 23, 1858, in an upstairs apartment in Bologna, a little boy lay asleep while grown men argued over the invisible. The papal carabinieri had come with a warrant and a reluctant air. Their leader, Marshal Pietro Lucidi, asked a few questions as if to warm the room with routine, and then spoke the sentence that split a household. "Your son has been baptized. We must take him." The mother, Mariana, flew to the bed and cried that they would have to kill her first. The father, Momolo Mortara, tried to reason with men who had been trained not to reason in such moments. They were, they said again and again, only executing orders. When the family's relatives hurried to the Dominican convent of San Domenico, where the Inquisitor Pier Gaetano Feletti lived among the tombs and memories of his order, the friar listened and repeated the same fatal grammar. He too was obeying. By late night he granted one mercy, 1 day's delay, and sent the police away with a note. 2 guards remained in the bedroom to watch the sleeping child as if he were already a prisoner. The next evening the officers returned. Lucidi lifted Edgardo from his father's arms. The policeman who had guarded him wept. Momolo followed the carriage down the stairs into the street and fainted. The boy was driven away into Rome, not by violence of fist, but by the violence of an idea. History often chooses a small domestic threshold for its decisive collisions. Behind that doorway in Bologna stood a mother's instinct, a father's pleading, and the ordinary sovereignty of a family over its own child. Outside, it stood a theocratic state, older than most European kingdoms, which claimed that a few drops of water and a formula spoken years before had transferred the boy, body and soul, into a different jurisdiction. What made the Mortara affair more than a private tragedy was not merely its cruelty, but its timing. The Papal States, with Rome at their center, had ruled parts of Italy for more than a millennium. They were a survival of medieval Christendom in an age that had begun to speak, imperfectly but insistently, of nations, citizens, and rights. In the 1850s, that survival had grown fragile. Italian unification, the Risorgimento, pressed on it like a rising tide. Then, in 1858, an episode that might once have been swallowed by local fear became, by the mechanisms of the modern press and the politics of an awakening Europe, an international scandal. It was theology made law, and law made spectacle. To understand why Rome believed it could remove a Jewish child from Jewish parents, one must enter a world in which sacrament was not metaphor, but fact, and in which the state's first duty was not to the individual's liberty, but to the soul's salvation. In Catholic theology, baptism is not a mere symbol of belonging. It is an act believed to affect what it signifies. It marks the person with an indelible character. Once baptized, always baptized. The rite cannot be undone by later repudiation, nor cancelled by the manner of its administration, provided the essentials were present. This metaphysical permanence had social consequences. In a confessional polity, where church and state are braided together, membership in the church could determine one's civil status as much as birth or residence. The Mortara affair turned on that premise with pitiless clarity. If Edgardo had truly been baptized, then in the eyes of the papal government he had become a Christian child, and the Papal States held that a Christian child could not be raised in a non-Christian household. The doctrine did not spring from 1858. It was an inheritance, codified and refined across centuries of Christian dominance. A key articulation came in 1747 when Pope Benedict XIV issued the bull Postremo Mensae, responding to cases in which Jewish children were baptized without parental consent. Benedict set out a set of distinctions that would later haunt Bologna. It was generally not licit to baptize a Jewish child without the parents' permission. It could be licit in danger of death. And, crucially, if a child had been baptized, whether licitly or illicitly, church authorities had a duty to remove the child from non-baptized parents and ensure a Christian upbringing. Punishments might fall on the illicit baptizer, but the invalidating concept did not apply. The sacrament, once done, did not retreat. Pius IX would later invoke this logic, and its famous refusal, non possumus, we cannot, was not offered as political obstinacy, but as theological necessity. For centuries, Rome had built institutions to embody this duty. Among them was the Casa dei Catecumeni, the House of Catechumens, founded in the mid-16th century to house and instruct those converting to Christianity, often Jews and Muslims, and later called also the Collegio dei Neofiti. It was a place where conversion was nourished, supervised, sometimes coerced, and always understood as a passage from one legal and social condition into another. The costs of maintaining this machinery could even be imposed on the Jewish communities themselves, as when a papal tax was levied on synagogues to support converts. Such arrangements were not mere curiosities of ecclesiastical administration. They were the infrastructure of a civilization that assumed, as naturally as breathing, that the Church had a claim upon bodies as well as consciences. Yet by the 19th century, that civilization was cracking. Pope Pius IX, elected in 1846, began his reign with an aura of reform. Many Italians and Europeans hoped he might reconcile Catholic tradition with modern aspirations. In the revolutionary spring of 1848, he sanctioned the tearing down of Rome's ghetto walls, an act heavy with symbolism after centuries of Jewish confinement and legal inferiority. But the revolutions that promised liberty also threatened papal sovereignty. When Pius refused to join an Italian war against Austria, uprisings broke out. He fled Rome. A Roman Republic was proclaimed and then crushed by foreign intervention. The Pope returned not as a liberal prince, but as a chastened ruler, increasingly convinced that modernity, nationalism, liberalism, secularization, was a flood against which the Church must brace itself. The Mortara affair unfolded within this changed temperament, a papacy that had flirted with reform and then recoiled into defiance. Bologna, in 1858, was the second-largest city of the Papal States, a prosperous, learned place, fat with agriculture and trade, and erudite with university tradition. Its Jewish community was small compared with the great communities of Eastern Europe, yet it bore the marks of the old order, a tolerated minority living under Christian dominance, permitted commerce and family life, but never allowed to forget its difference. In such a setting, families like the Mortaras tried to craft ordinary happiness from constrained circumstances. They were merchants. They had several children. They employed a servant, Anna Maurici, whose presence already hinted at the porous borders between communities in a city where Christians and Jews did business in daylight and maintained their separations by custom, regulation, and faith. The spark of catastrophe was, in itself, almost banal. A child fell ill. According to Maurici's later testimony, years before the abduction, when Edgardo was an infant, she believed he was dying. Fear and piety, and perhaps the superstitions that cling to the edges of religion, seized her. She performed an emergency baptism, sprinkling water on the child's head and speaking the Trinitarian formula. She told no one in the family. The boy recovered. The household returned to its routine, and an act meant to rescue a soul from death waited, like a delayed poison, to work its civil effects. In late 1857, the story reached the Inquisitor of Bologna, Pier Gaetano Felletti, through rumor. Felletti questioned Maurici, took her statement, and sent it to Rome with a request for authorization. The machinery that had been built for centuries to translate sacrament into jurisdiction began to turn. It is one of the ironies of institutions that they can condemn an act in principle and enforce its consequences in practice. The Holy Office in Rome disapproved, officially, of forced conversions. It also recognized the sacramental finality of baptism. Here was the contradiction, sharpened into policy. The law of the Papal States held it illegal to remove a child from non-Christian parents for baptism unless the child was dying. Yet if a child had indeed been baptized, even illicitly, the same order held that the Church must remove the child and provide Christian education. The cardinals assessed Maurice's story and accepted it as credible. Folletti received instructions to arrange the child's removal and transport to the House of Catechumens in Rome. In a state where theology and law interlocked, a maid's memory became a warrant. The details of the seizure have been retold so often because they possess the concentrated tragedy of a Greek scene. The chorus is the crowd outside, the gods are the unseen authorities, and the hero is a child who cannot speak for himself in a language that matters. Lucidi's men arrived soon after sunset on June 23rd. Lucidi told the Mortaras, almost apologetically, that they were victim of a betrayal and that he had orders to remove the boy. Mariana's hysteria was the sound of motherhood striking against the wall of the state. Lucidi offered to take the father to the inquisitor. Momolo refused, but sent his eldest son to summon relatives. In the convent at San Domenico, Padovani and Moscato begged Folletti at least to grant a delay. He yielded one day, on condition the family not attempt to hide the child. 2 policemen stayed in the bedroom that night, like sentries over an innocent. The next day, the family tried, frantically, almost absurdly, to find higher officials who might overrule the order, the cardinal legate, the archbishop. Neither was in Bologna. Toward evening, Momolo made a last plea to Folletti. The friar repeated his reassurance that the boy would be under the protection of the Pope. At about 8 o'clock, the carabinieri returned with 2 carriages. Lucidi took Edgardo from his father's arms. Tears ran down the guards' faces. Momolo fainted in the street, and the child was driven away. From Bologna to Rome, the road was more than a physical route. It was a passage from one universe of belonging into another. In Rome, Edgardo was placed in the House of Catechumens, the institutional womb of conversion. There he would be instructed in catechism, prayers, and the habits of Christian life. He would be surrounded by clerics and converts who understood his presence not as kidnapping, but as providence. The papal government did not deny the pain it caused. It often narrated that pain as the necessary price of saving a soul. The boy's parents, meanwhile, moved through the first stage of modern political despair, petitioning, lobbying, seeking allies across borders, learning the slow machinery of publicity. They did not even know at first where their son had been taken. Only later did they find that the destination was Rome. Here the case began to reveal the changes of the age. Jews in Western Europe had gained, unevenly, new forms of voice, emancipation in some states, access to print culture, and an emerging sense of transnational solidarity. The Mortaras, supported by Jewish communities in Italy and abroad, drafted appeals and sought diplomatic help. The papal government at first inclined to ignore them, an old habit of rule, but reconsidered when newspapers began reporting the affair. Cardinal Secretary of State Giacomo Antonelli, anxious about the Papal States' precarious standing, arranged meetings and concessions, including allowing Momolo to visit Edgardo in the House of Catechumens. The Church, which had long relied on silence and local power, now found itself argued with in public, in multiple languages, across frontiers. The visits of the father produced one of the most contested elements of the story, the child's own desire. 2 narratives, each psychologically plausible, each politically useful, grew around those meetings. In one, favored by the parents and their supporters, Edgardo was a frightened boy longing for home, cowed by clerical supervision, and crying for his mother on the road to Rome. In the other, favored by Catholic defenders, he became a miniature apostle, learning the catechism quickly, embracing his new identity, even urging his parents to convert. The clash of narratives was more than propaganda. It was the first skirmish in a modern war over the meaning of the child's will. A 6-year-old's words, filtered through adults with interests, became evidence for or against the legitimacy of the state. In earlier centuries, no one would have imagined that a child's preference could arbitrate a dispute between church and family. In the 19th century, such questions were beginning to matter, and the Mortara affair made them unavoidable. Pius IX's role in the early decision-making may have been indirect. The Holy Office handled such cases with bureaucratic routine, and the Pope did not attend every meeting. But once the case erupted publicly, Pius became its center. He refused to return the child. He asserted that what he had done he had the right and duty to do, and that if the circumstances recurred, he would do the same again. This was the voice of a ruler who felt himself bound by divine law, and it was also the voice of a temporal prince defending a temporal prerogative. In the eyes of Pius and his advisers, the essential point was simple. Baptism had made the child a Catholic. To leave him with Jewish parents would endanger his faith and salvation. The Church could not permit that. The phrase that circulated, non possumus, was not only a refusal, it was an announcement that the Church, at least in this matter, would not negotiate with modern sentiment. The world answered with the new power of outrage. The case became, in David Kurtzer's phrase, a publicist's dream. It spread through Europe and across the Atlantic, inflamed also by Protestant and liberal hostility toward the papacy. In the United States, where anti-Catholic sentiment already colored politics, newspapers seized on the affair as proof that papal rule was incompatible with liberty. Reports multiplied, and major papers covered the story repeatedly. In Britain, where the press could be ferocious and the political class guarded its Protestant identity, the Mortara affair was offered as an emblem of tyranny in Rome. Jewish communities held meetings and sent petitions. Prominent figures sought audiences. Even Catholic sovereigns, according to contemporary reports, advised the Pope not to defy European opinion. If the Papal States had once been sheltered by the reverence due to religion, they were now exposed to the harsher daylight of public scrutiny. Rome's defenders answered in kind, and the controversy displayed, like a diagram, the conflict of two moral worlds. For Catholic supporters, the affair was a drama of salvation, a child rescued, however painfully, from spiritual peril and entrusted to the Church as a new family. They emphasized the indelible character of baptism and the Church's duty to educate the baptized. For critics, the affair was kidnapping and coercion, the state's power used to enforce conversion and to punish a minority for its faith. In this duel of principles, the modern liberal idea of rights, parental rights, religious liberty, equality before the law, met the older Christian idea that truth has jurisdiction and that error has no rights against the salvation of a soul. In such collisions, there is rarely a compromise. One must win or retreat. The Papal States, clinging to the older principle, tried to stand, but they stood on ground already shaking. Even diplomacy, that cautious art of postponing conflict, felt the case's pressure. Napoleon III of France, whose troops helped protect the Pope's temporal rule in Rome, found himself in an impossible posture. To support Pius was to offend liberal and secular opinion. To abandon him was to anger French Catholics. Contemporary historians have suggested that the Mortara scandal weakened support for the papacy in France and contributed to a shift in policy. In early 1859, Napoleon concluded a secret pact with the Kingdom of Sardinia, aligning himself with forces that would soon drive Austria from northern Italy and accelerate unification. Whether Mortara was decisive or merely emblematic, the timing is instructive. A single child's fate became entangled with the calculations of emperors and prime ministers. In modern politics, moral outrage is often a lever. It moves what arguments alone cannot. The Papal States lost Bologna's region in the storms of 1859, As pontifical rule ended there, the case entered a new phase: retribution and trial. The Inquisitor Feletti, once untouchable behind the sanctity of his office, was arrested by the new authorities and prosecuted for his role in the seizure. The trial raised a question that remains modern. Can one be criminally guilty for enforcing a law that was valid under the previous regime? Even within the old legal framework, prosecutors argued that procedures had been abused. Defenders argued that the Inquisitor had merely carried out instructions from Rome. The court acquitted him, concluding that he had not acted on his own initiative. The verdict satisfied few, but it exposed a crucial point. The abduction was not a rogue cleric's cruelty. It was the policy of a state anchored in papal authority. Meanwhile, the Mortara's private life became a long, bruising pilgrimage through European capitals and chancelleries. They returned to Bologna, then moved to Turin in Piedmont, now the beating heart of the unification movement, where their tragedy could be used as a political symbol. They sought help from new Jewish organizations and old networks of patronage, and the case contributed, in the view of several historians, to a fresh sense of international Jewish solidarity. In 1860, partly under the impetus of this and similar outrages, the Alliance Israélite Universelle was formed in Paris to defend Jewish civil rights across the world, a modern institution born from an ancient vulnerability. The Mortara affair thus helped turn the scattered sufferings of minorities into organized political action, one of the characteristic transformations of the 19th century. As years passed, Edgardo grew up in Rome under the Pope's patronage. In January 1861, at an annual audience with Rome's Jewish community, the visitors were startled to find the boy, now older, at the Pope's side, a living emblem of the Church's victory in this contest. The parents' hopes shifted from legal appeal to political transformation. Perhaps, if the Papal States fell, their child could be restored. Yet the very passage of time worked against them. A child removed at 6 and raised in a new language of faith can become, by adolescence, sincerely at home in the new world. What begins as coercion can end as identity. The tragedy deepened precisely because the case could not be resolved by a simple return. Years of formation had intervened. The dispute, in part, became a contest over whose story would become the boy's memory. In 1870, the Kingdom of Italy captured Rome, ending the Papal States as a temporal power. The Pope, who had once ruled territories like a medieval prince, retreated into the Vatican and began the long Roman question of sovereignty and loss. Edgardo, now a young man, left Italy. He was ordained in 1873 and pursued a priestly life largely outside the peninsula. Sources report that he entered the canons regular of the Lateran and took Pius as his religious name, as if to seal his attachment to the Pope who had claimed him. He died in Belgium in 1940, an almost unbearable coda, for it means that the boy taken in 1858 lived into the age of radios and mechanized war, his life overlapping with the modern world whose principles had condemned his abduction. The parents did not cease to be parents. After Rome fell, they sought help again from the new Italian government, but their son, by then 18 or older, refused to abandon Catholicism, and the state could not easily reverse what decades of formation had made. Reports from Jewish sources record that Edgardo later attended his mother's funeral in the 1890s, and that in adulthood he could meet family members more freely, as if time had at last loosened the chains that ideology had tightened. Yet reconciliation in such cases is never complete. The family's wound had been opened not only by the loss of a child, but by the humiliation of powerlessness. To be told that one's child can be reclassified by an act done without one's knowledge, and then claimed by the state, is to be reminded that one lives not as an equal citizen, but as a tolerated subject. What, then, does the Mortara affair reveal when we look past its melodrama and see it as a specimen of political anthropology? First, it shows how a confessional state defines citizenship not primarily by territory or consent, but by sacramental belonging. In the Papal States, baptism was not only theology, it was a kind of civil registration, more potent than the parent's will. A child's status could change without the parent's knowledge, and that change carried legal consequences enforced by police. Modern liberal states also define status, citizen, resident, ward, minor, but they generally ground it in birth, law, and paperwork. The Papal States grounded it in a metaphysical act that could be performed by almost anyone, anywhere, at any time, and then later invoked as decisive. A single whispered right became an instrument of sovereignty. Second, the case exposes the precariousness of minority rights when rights depend on the goodwill of the majority's religion. The Mortaras were not foreigners, they were inhabitants of Bologna. Yet, in the papal legal imagination, their parental authority was conditional, because Judaism itself was treated as error tolerated rather than as a civic identity protected. The state could, when it wished, override their family with the claim that it protected the higher interests of the child's soul. To modern ears, the language sounds like fanaticism. To the older Catholic world, it sounded like responsibility. The collision here is not merely between cruelty and kindness, but between two hierarchies of goods. One places salvation above family continuity, the other places family integrity and freedom of conscience above the state's religious mission. Third, the Mortara affair helps explain how papal temporal power approached its end. Empires and states do not fall solely because they lose battles. They fall because they lose legitimacy. The Papal States in the 19th century were already suspect to liberals as an anachronism, a priest-ruled territory in an age of constitutions and national parliaments. The abduction of a child for religious reasons crystallized that suspicion into a story the public could grasp. It was no longer an abstract debate about sovereignty. It was a mother's scream, a fainting father, a carriage disappearing into the night. Public opinion, newly mobilized by mass newspapers, began to treat papal rule not as sacred, but as politically backward. Some historians have argued that the case notably influenced France's willingness to support Italian unification by undermining popular sympathy for the papacy. Whether or not it moved the great levers alone, it revealed that the Pope's temporal regime was now vulnerable to the moral tribunals of the modern world. Finally, the affair illuminates a deeper transformation, the shift from an age in which the state felt entitled, indeed obligated, to shape souls, to an age in which the state increasingly claims neutrality among faiths and locates sovereignty in the individual and the nation. Pius IX's stance, the famous non-possumus, was in a sense consistent with a long tradition, but consistency can become a form of blindness when the world changes around it. The Pope could not, without betraying his theological premises, treat baptism as a private rite lacking civil force. Yet the modern age could not, without betraying its emerging liberal premises, accept that a sacrament could nullify parental rights and minority protections. The Mortara affair was therefore not an accident but a revelation. It showed, in a single family's ruin, that the medieval synthesis of altar and throne could no longer coexist peacefully with the 19th century's creed of rights.